What has been covered so far in this series are what we might consider the founding miracles of the Restoration, and these comprise the first half of Joseph Smith's story. For those who knew the young Joseph, the theme of these years prior to 1830 was what they called Joseph's gift, which seemed to give him special access to God's mind and will. It seems that in his early teenage years, he was still sorting out his connection to the divine, and may have viewed his gift through the lens of his superstitious rural culture. But by the time Joseph began his purported encounters with the angel at age 17, he began to realize his gift was something much bigger than he may have originally thought. In the space of a few years, Joseph went from being a pretty typical backwoods teen to someone engaging in either actual revelations from God, or, at the very least, what must be considered myth-making and religious ingenuity rarely, if ever, seen in history. It should also be kept in mind that in the early years, as Joseph sought revelation from God, it seems he used a physical medium, like the stones and the Nephite interpreters, or perhaps even his seer stone, to in some way focus his concentration and exercise his gift. However, it seems that sometime prior to the publication of the Book of Mormon, Joseph realized he did not need a physical medium to exercise his gift and receive revelation. And it was Joseph's revelations that became the basis and foundation of Joseph's work for the rest of his life. Joseph stood in sharp contrast to the creedal Christian tradition that has long held that general revelation through prophets ended with the original 12 apostles. But for Latter-day Saints to this day, these events in Joseph's life were and are at the heart of their belief that the heavens are still open. However, in the first half of Joseph's life, a church does not seem to be the objective. It's not until the text of the Book of Mormon is produced that the full vision comes into view, a vision of a latter-day work on a biblical scale. And it's this vision of changing the world by establishing God's kingdom on earth through continuing revelation that seems to fuel Joseph for the rest of his life. So after rendering the text of the Book of Mormon, Joseph dictated the following revelation given in the summer of 1829. A great and marvelous work is about to come forth unto the children of men. Seek to bring forth and establish my Zion. Wherefore I must bring forth the fullness of my gospel from the Gentiles unto the house of Israel. So at the same time the Book of Mormon was being published, during the first cold months of 1830, Oliver and Joseph put together an official charter in order to establish the church. This charter, also known as the Articles and Covenants of the Church of Christ, laid out a brief outline of the founding story of the church, its basic beliefs, and its initial structure. So on April 6, 1830, just a couple of weeks after the Book of Mormon rolled off the presses, Joseph and Oliver officially organized the church. On this day, the family and friends of the Smiths, who had been convinced of Joseph's special gift, gathered. This group of about 40 people named Joseph and Oliver first and second elders of the church. Bread and wine were blessed, hymns were sung, prayers were said, and testimonies were borne. About 6 people were baptized that day, including Martin Harris, Joseph's parents, and Joseph's 16-year-old friend and neighbor, Porter Rockwell. It was a day of excitement for all involved. But considering Joseph's father had always been against organized religion, it was his baptism that most sharply affected Joseph.
Joseph stood upon the shore, and taking his father by the hand, he exclaimed with tears of joy, "Oh, my God, have I lived to see my own father baptized into the true church of Jesus Christ."
The initial conversions happened largely through family ties with those connected to the witnesses in the areas around Fayette and 3 days south in Colesville. The Whitmers, the Jollies, the Rockwells, the Knights, and of course the Smiths were the main families. But it was Joseph's brother Samuel that is credited with being the first missionary, when on June 30th he set out to the general public with copies of the Book of Mormon in a bag on his shoulder. Samuel's first attempts at missionary work were met with little interest and with much hostility, but one of the copies of the Book of Mormon he gave away that summer would eventually end up, a few years later, in the hands of a young seeker named Brigham Young. Now, some might assume that in this rural and less educated environment, Joseph's book would have been more warmly received by the credulous rural farmers. But right from the start, the Book of Mormon was seen by people, much as it is seen generally by people today, as a fraud. The common mocking title people gave the book was Joe Smith's Gold Bible. And while Joseph's immediate family believed him right from the start, his extended family seems to have still needed to be convinced. Joseph's uncle John recounted what happened that summer when Joseph Sr. came to visit his brothers and father to discuss with them the whole affair.
As soon as we were settled, Brother Jesse and Joseph Sr. entered into conversation respecting their families. Joseph Sr. briefly related the history of his family, the death of Alvin, etc. He then began to speak of the discovery and translation of the Book of Mormon. At this, Jesse grew very angry and exclaimed, "If you say another word about that Book of Mormon, you shall not stay a minute longer in my house, and if I can't get you out any other way, I'll hew you down with my broadaxe." We had always been accustomed to being treated with much harshness by our brother, but he had never carried it to so great an extent before.
Still, despite the resistance from his son Jesse, the elderly patriarch Asahel Smith seemed to be more open-minded.
After the usual salutations, the subject of the Book of Mormon was introduced. Father received with gladness that which Joseph Sr. communicated and remarked that he had always expected that something would appear to make known the true gospel.
Interestingly, Joseph's uncle John, many years after his conversion, remembered his own skepticism.
Father seemed pleased with every word Joseph Sr. said, but I must confess that I was too pious at that time to believe one word of it.
But this changed once John actually took the whole thing seriously and decided to read the book and reflect sincerely on its message.
I took my brother Joseph Sr. 20 miles on his journey the next day as I had agreed. Before he left me, he requested me to promise him that I would read the Book of Mormon, which he had given me, and that even should I not believe it, that I would not condemn it. For, he said, if you do not condemn it, you shall have a testimony of its truth. I fulfilled my promise, and thus proved his testimony to be true.
If even Joseph's own family had skeptics, you can only imagine the skepticism in the general public. However, the claims of this new church did not rest on Joseph's word alone. There were 11 living witnesses to the plates, and a growing number of people close to Joseph who were willing to back his claims, vouch for his character, and testify of the book's spiritual power. When people realized that this was not merely Joseph Smith's claim alone, some were willing to take the claims at least seriously enough to actually read the book and sincerely consider its message. Many of the early converts reported on how the book affected them spiritually and how its message seemed to fulfill their religious yearnings. One of the converts from that first summer of missionary work was Parley Pratt, who was later dubbed by some as the Apostle Paul of Mormonism due to his own missionary zeal after his own conversion. Pratt, like many of the early converts, recalled his first encounter with the Book of Mormon.
A man named Hamlin began to tell of a book, a strange book, a very strange book, in his possession, which had just been published. He promised me the perusal of it at his house the next day if I would call. I felt a strange interest in the book. I opened it with eagerness and read its title page. I then read the testimony of the several witnesses in relation to the manner of its being found and translated. After this, I read all day. Eating was a burden. I had no desire for food. Sleep was a burden when night came, for I preferred reading to sleep. As I read, the Spirit of the Lord was upon me, and I knew and comprehended that the book was true.
This was and is a common pattern in Latter-day Saint missionary work. Some like to characterize Smith as a charismatic, whose personality was able to swoon people into delusions. And while Joseph was certainly known for being charismatic, the historical record shows that most of the early converts during the first decade of Joseph's movement were converted long before they ever met Joseph. So whatever might be said of Smith, it's a simple historical fact that the book he produced now has millions who say it has deeply impacted them spiritually, sometimes in life-altering ways. As the summer of 1830 rolled on, Joseph was determined to continue to use his gift to guide the small church and solve problems. And one of the major problems in the religious debates of the time was how the Bible should be properly understood. So at some point that summer, Joseph set out on an ambitious project to seek the Lord's revelation, to produce his own divinely guided interpretations and expansions of the Bible, which later were given the name the Joseph Smith translation. It's important to keep in mind that it does not seem that this was ever intended to be a new, full-blown Bible translation to replace the King James Version. Instead, it was something more like an inspired commentary, clarification, or revelatory expansion of the biblical text. So that summer, Joseph began at the beginning of the Bible, which resulted in a large expansion to the book of Genesis. The 14-page expansion included details about Moses' interactions with God on Mount Sinai, thus earning it the name, the Book of Moses. It also contained a collection of prophecies from Enoch. Remarkably, Joseph's renderings of this Enochic literature correspond deeply with Enochic literature that was not discovered until the 1940s, as well as other Enochic literature that almost certainly was not available to a farm laborer in rural New York. A close analysis of what Joseph produced in 1830 reveals that it either was what Joseph claimed it was, or at the very least, it should be considered a remarkable work of pseudepigrapha. And while this is all pretty radical stuff on its own, it's hard to understate how wildly blasphemous this was in Joseph's 1830 context. Joseph producing new scripture and correcting old scripture could only be seen as the absolute worst kind of heresy in his Protestant culture of biblical infallibility. It should also be clear that Joseph was not acting like some reformer or someone seeking to create just another Christian congregation. Joseph was fully convinced his gift was from God, and it made him a prophet with as much legitimacy as Moses or Peter. And one can only imagine how this would inflame the passions of the local Protestant hardliners. So it should be of little surprise that the local religious population was extremely hostile to Joseph and his new church, especially considering they were actively seeking new converts. For example, when the Book of Mormon was initially released, local preachers immediately encouraged everyone to boycott the book. Martin Harris was especially concerned about this, considering he had mortgaged his farm in order to get the books printed. This growing opposition to the new church painted Joseph as a lazy, superstitious treasure digger, and those around him as credulous dupes. However, it's likely that these reports were inspired more by a dislike for the new church than anything else, as there is little in the historical record prior to 1830 to indicate the Smiths were seriously disliked by the local community. Joseph's brother William remembered the strange change in attitude toward their family.
We never knew we were bad folks until Joseph told of his vision. We were considered respectable till then. Whenever the neighbors wanted a good day's work, they knew where they could get a good hand. And Joseph did his share of the work along with the rest of the boys. But at once, people began to circulate falsehoods and stories in a wonderful way.
It's also worth noting that researchers have found that the Smith farm actually appreciated more in value than other comparable farms during their time in New York, which supports William's account against the claims that the Smiths were lazy. It also should be remembered that this was all happening in the context of rural 1830s frontier justice, an era where things like lynch mobs would take things into their own hands and use violence if needed to rid communities of anyone they saw as undesirable. Understanding this context is essential, as these vigilante mobs were a constant threat in the rural environment of Joseph and his followers for the rest of Joseph's life. Joseph's first major encounter with mobs happened in late June of 1830, when Joseph and Oliver traveled to Colesville, New York, an area not far from Emma's hometown. They went to have a conference with a small group of members there and to baptize new converts. This was the same area where Joseph had been taken to court after Josiah Stowell's silver mine venture failed. And considering Joseph had eloped with the local Emma Hale, there should be little surprise that some in the community were hostile to this outsider coming back to town to baptize locals into his new heretical church. The locals tore out the dam they had made for the baptisms, and later a mob of 50 or so surrounded the knight's house where Joseph was staying.
That night our wagons were turned over and wood piled on them, and some sunk in the water. Rails were piled against our doors, and a great deal of mischief done.
The next day the mob was still around when a local constable showed up. But instead of dispersing the mob, he arrested Joseph on the same charges of glass looking from 4 years earlier during the silver mine venture with Josiah Stowell. But it seems clear that this trial was really being used by locals as a way to try and put Joseph's project to an end by exposing to all that he was nothing more than a con man. However, at the trial, Joseph was defended by a variety of people and was acquitted of any charges. This only made the mob angrier, and Joseph was almost immediately arrested again for the same charges, this time to be tried in the next county over. Joseph recalled the sheriff who arrested him treated him roughly, only giving him a little bread and water to eat, and then allowing a mob to harass him.
He gathered in a number of men who used every means to abuse, ridicule, and insult me. They spit upon me, pointed their fingers at me, saying, "Prophesy, prophesy."
Apparently, the entire situation with Joseph caused a major buzz with the locals, as it was reported that over 400 people showed up for the trial, and 3 judges were summoned, as this was a trial that would have the power to expel Joseph from the county. Many had heard rumors about Smith, and this was their chance to see Joseph finally exposed as a fraud and a con man. Luckily for Joseph, his friends hired a local attorney named John Reed, who was known to be a good speaker. John Reed was not and never became a Latter-day Saint, but interestingly, he said the following about the whole affair.
I saw the persecution was great against him, and while Mr. Knight was pleading with me to go defend him, a particular impression or thought struck my mind that I must go defend him, for he was the Lord's anointed. I believe to this day that God was on his side to deliver him from them wicked sons of bitches, for that boy Joseph sat there apparently as unconcerned as if he was in his father's house. And when a hard witness would come upon the stand, I would say to him that our case looked bad. But he said with a smile on his countenance, "I shall be cleared."
Again, Joseph was acquitted by all 3 judges. So now at the age of 24, Joseph had been before a total of 5 different judges being accused of being a con man, but none convicted him. And this only made the mobs angrier. Many from this disgruntled group of locals would not long after all of this become the basis for the earliest anti-Mormon publications. However, it was not just the justices that were convinced of Joseph's innocence. The trial apparently convinced many onlookers that what was really going on was religious bigotry, and Joseph was being unfairly treated. Notably, even the sheriff who had arrested Joseph had a change of heart after hearing the full story laid out in court. He even apologized for his earlier harsh treatment and warned Joseph that the mob was planning to tar and feather him. He then showed Joseph out the back door so he could escape without harm. All of this no doubt took a toll on Joseph's wife, Emma. Emma was worried about the threats to her husband, their family, as well as their financial future. Joseph sought guidance in prayer and received a revelation specifically geared toward Emma.
Hearken unto the voice of the Lord your God while I speak unto you, Emma Smith, my daughter. Thou art an elect lady, whom I have called. Thou needest not fear, for thy husband shall support thee in the church. For unto them is his calling, that all things might be revealed unto them. And verily I say unto thee, that thou shalt lay aside the things of this world, and seek for the things of a better.
Emma was also told she would be ordained to minister, teach, and expound scripture in the church, thus setting a precedent of Latter-day Saint women being involved even in leadership capacities in the church. She was also given a special assignment of assembling an official hymn book. Many of the hymns she selected from the Protestant hymns of the time are still mainstays in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to this day. Music has, from the very start, been an important part of Latter-day Saint identity, which should not be surprising as this revelation to Emma was canonized and it included the following.
For my soul delighteth in the song of the heart, Yea, the song of the righteous is a prayer unto me, and it shall be answered with a blessing upon their heads.
So as the fall of 1830 approached, Joseph and Emma moved back north to be closer to Joseph's family and avoid the more aggressive mobs in southern New York. Also, about this time, Joseph began to record his 15 or so revelations, which were viewed by Joseph and all of those around him as scripture. The eminent historian Richard Bushman summed up very well the unique historical nature of Joseph's revelations.
It's unusual to note that the first revelation to Joseph is chastising him. He is a listener on the revelations. Revelations were very different than normal words of Joseph. These revelations governed the church, and even in private letters, Joseph would say, "The Lord commanded us," including himself. The revelations carried authority even though Joseph did not fall into trances like Ellen White or withdraw into the desert like Muhammad. Most of Joseph's revelations came while he sat in council with his followers. Parley Pratt, in later years, described how a revelation was received.
John Murdoch and several other elders asked Joseph to inquire of the Lord. They joined in prayer in the translating room, and Joseph dictated a revelation. Each sentence was uttered slowly and very distinctly, with a pause between each, sufficiently long for it to be recorded. This was the manner in which all his written revelations were dictated. There never was any hesitation, reviewing, or reading back. As he dictated them, so they stood, so far as I have witnessed.
Joseph was likely seeking the Lord's guidance very regularly at this point as he began to face new challenges. As the fall of 1830 approached, the church was almost 6 months old, and Joseph's role was beginning to change. In the past, he was merely a young man with a gift, but he was fast becoming the leader of an organized church body with small groups of members in the Palmyra and Fayette area in upstate New York, as well as in the areas around Colesville and Harmony, about 3 days' journey south. And this involved the work of administration. In September, Joseph was faced with his first significant ecclesiastical conflict. Apparently, David Whitmer and Oliver took issue with something said in one of the revelations and wondered if it should be revised. Joseph was confused how such close associates would come to feel that way.
By what authority David took upon him to command me to alter or erase, to add to or diminish from, a revelation or commandment from Almighty God.
However, after some discussion with David and Oliver, he eventually was able to get them to agree with his position. One interesting fact about the ecclesiastical systems and protocols set up by Joseph were that they were not some kind of pure dictatorship. Joseph even found himself in later years in front of the very disciplinary councils that he organized. Still, this was not a Protestant priesthood of all believers either. Joseph clearly believed people had different roles to play in the kingdom, and his role, because of his gift, was to be like that of Moses. This was made explicit when Joseph faced another ecclesiastical challenge that September. Hiram Page, the brother-in-law of David Whitmer, claimed he also had received revelation for the church through a seer stone. This disturbed Joseph, but not because he feared other people receiving revelation. Though Joseph and Oliver were named the first and second elders of the church, they were fully on board with others receiving revelation. But now Joseph was facing a situation that called into question what revelations were binding on the church, and he sought guidance from God.
Joseph was in great distress of mind. That night I occupied the same room that he did, and the greater part of the night was spent in prayer and supplication.
Joseph reported that he had received the following in response to his prayers, and so he had it read at the September conference.
Verily, verily, I say unto thee, no one shall be appointed to receive commandments and revelations in this church, excepting my servant, Joseph Smith, Jr., for he receiveth them even as Moses, to declare faithfully the commandments and the revelations with power and authority unto the church.
Apparently those present were persuaded, as there is nothing in the historical record to indicate significant resistance to this notion. Joseph reported at the conference,
The whole church, including Hiram Page, renounced the said stone and all things connected therewith, much to our mutual satisfaction and happiness.
But it was not all problems and issues at the September conference. Two major things were announced at that conference that would change the course of Latter-day Saint history. Probably the biggest thing made known in the September 1830 conference was that the Lord intended for the saints to prepare to go west to the borders of the American frontier. At this time, the state of Missouri was the farthest western state, and beyond it was Indian territory. The intention was that somewhere in this new western land, they were to establish the gathering place for those who were to join the new church. The vision was the creation of a city, like the city of Enoch in the Bible, known as the city of Zion. And considering Joseph was in the midst of rendering his version of Enochic literature, there is little doubt that Joseph saw himself as a sort of modern Enoch. The establishment of Zion was the central theme of Joseph's mission for the rest of his life. This Zion was to be a place where the righteous would gather and live together in a harmonious community. It was intended to be the place that would become a city on a hill and an example to the world. It was to be the central hub of the movement to establish Zion in a more general sense around the world as the kingdom of God. This central gathering place was to become the New Jerusalem, prophesied in the Bible to come about in the last days. Now, on a personal note, even just on a historical level, I can't help but be somewhat baffled that someone like Joseph Smith, within only a few short years, went from being a relative nobody looking for odd jobs on people's farms to suddenly producing new volumes of scripture, talking of founding cities, and being convinced that he was going to fulfill global-scale biblical prophecies. And the 24-year-old Smith was doing all this when the total number of people following him was probably less than 100. Many 24-year-olds are idealistic, but this sort of grandeur of vision and boldness of action from someone who spent his life doing odd jobs as a farm laborer has to be admitted as something unusual. And while in history there certainly have been self-proclaimed visionaries who have started idealistic communities, usually their movements are fairly short-lived. Joseph's ability to inspire such intense commitment to his vision even long after his death is truly fascinating historically, and one of the reasons I think his story deserves serious study. Also, the bold vision and action did not stop with just the establishment of a new city. At the conference, missionaries were also called to fulfill a promise in the Book of Mormon that the fullness of the gospel of Jesus Christ would go to the native peoples of the American continent. For this mission, he would call his right-hand advisor Oliver Cowdery, the zealous 23-year-old convert Parley Pratt, and a few others to go to the western border of the United States with two goals. First was the goal of finding the location for the gathering place. The other was to preach the gospel to the native peoples in the area who had been removed from their ancestral homelands into a series of reservations along the border of western Missouri. Parley Pratt had only met Joseph a few days before he was called on this mission, and he later remembered the experience with fondness.
He received me with a hearty welcome, and with that frank and kind manner so universal with him. And afterwards, I listened with interest to a discourse from his own mouth, filled with intelligence and wisdom.
So as Parley and his companions headed west towards the new frontier, a new wave of harassment began. Rather suddenly, the Smiths' creditors, who before had been flexible with the Smith family on payment terms, began to turn on the Smiths and call in their debts. There also seems to be some suggestion that members of the local Masonic lodge, of which Hiram Smith had been involved, joined with others who wanted to do what they could to rid the community of Joseph and his family. However, it's also possible that the creditors had got word that the Smiths might be moving west, and they feared that they might not pay them. Regardless, Lucy recounted an experience when a local Quaker came to their home demanding payment, and Lucy tried to intervene.
"Sir," I interrupted, taking my gold beads from my neck and holding them towards him, "these beads are the full value of the remainder of the debt. I beseech you to take them and give up the note." He replied, "No, I will not. Thou must pay the money, or thy husband shall go straightway to jail." I entreated the officer to allow me time to get someone to become my husband's security, but he refused. I then requested that my husband might be permitted to eat the porridge which I had been preparing, as he had taken no nourishment since the night before. This was also denied. The Quaker stood standing guard over my husband, who sat in the burning sun, faint and sick. I shall make no remarks in regard to my feelings on this occasion. Any human heart can imagine how I felt. They drove off with my husband, leaving me alone with my little girl.
And it got worse when another creditor came with other men and began taking goods from the house after calling in the Smiths' debts. Lucy remembered her 19-year-old son William's reaction when he came home to find strange men taking their things.
Just at this instant, William bounded into the house. "Mother, in the name of God, what are these men doing here?" I told him, in short, that they had taken his father to prison and had now come after Hiram, but not finding him, they were plundering the house. Hereupon William seized a large handspike, sprang up the stairs, and in one instant cleared the scoundrels out of the chamber. They scampered downstairs, he flew after them, and bounding into the very midst of the crowd, he brandished his handspike in every direction, exclaiming, "Away from here, you cutthroats, or I will be the death of every one of you." He continued to harangue them boisterously until his audience had left him. They seemed to believe what he said and fled in every direction.
Of all her children, William was the most temperamental. Still, it was a stressful time for the Smiths as their father reported from his cell to their son Samuel the following.
Immediately after I left your mother, the men by whom I was taken commenced using every possible argument to induce me to renounce the Book of Mormon, saying how much better it would be for you to deny that silly thing than to be disgraced and imprisoned. From the time that I entered until now, and this is the 4th day, I've had nothing to eat, save a pint basin full of very weak broth.
Samuel was very much wounded by this, and, having obtained permission of the jailer, he immediately went out and brought his father some comfortable food, after which he remained with him until the next morning.
Father Smith was in debtor's prison for 30 days, but Lucy did recall it was not a total loss.
He preached during his confinement here every Sunday, and when he was released, he baptized 2 persons whom he had thus converted.
About this same time as the missionaries headed west, they decided to stop and visit Parley Pratt's former pastor in the area around Kirtland, Ohio. His name was Sidney Rigdon. Rigdon was a Campbellite minister, but had fairly recently become disaffected with the Campbellite movement. And when approached by his friend Parley, he was open to reading the Book of Mormon. However, Rigdon was a formally trained minister. David Whitmer remembered,
"He was a thorough Bible scholar, a man of fine education, and a powerful orator."
Rigdon's children and others recalled that as Rigdon began reading, he did not believe a word of it. But something changed over time. His son recalled that as he read further,
he got so engaged in the book that it was hard for him to quit long enough to eat his meals. He read it day and night.
If nothing else, Rigdon was impressed at the complexity and theology of the book, and was even more blown away that it had come from an uneducated farm laborer.
He expressed the utmost amazement that such a man should write a book which seemed to shed a flood of light on all the old scriptures, open their profoundest mysteries, and give them perfect consistency and complete system. Thus he reasoned, if God ever gave a revelation, surely this must be divine.
But it was not until an apparent spiritual experience with the book that he overcame his skepticism and was fully convinced that the book was of God. And at the same time that this was all happening, other members of Rigdon's congregation began to also show interest in the book. Oliver wrote excitedly back to Joseph,
"There is considerable call here for books, and I wish you would send 500.
This was a missionary breakthrough. Finally, there was a large group of people willing to take the Book of Mormon seriously, and it had the desired effect. In November of 1830, Oliver, Parley, and the others with them were able to baptize Sidney Rigdon, as well as many other people connected with him. And many of these converts were foundational in later events in church history. People like Orson Hyde, Lyman Wright, Frederick G. Williams, and John Murdoch were all connected to this time. And these were not religiously indifferent individuals. Many were connected with Isaac Morley, who had started a sort of communal farm near Kirtland where many were attempting to live an economic system like that described in the book of Acts, where believers cared for one another by voluntarily holding their property in common. Rigdon also was no small convert. He was a professionally trained minister who was 13 years older than Joseph, and was rumored to have brought as many as 1,000 people to faith during his years of ministry as a Campbellite. But he wanted to meet Joseph himself, so he set out in December for New York. He was accompanied by another major figure in LDS history, Edward Partridge, who had not yet made the decision to be baptized. But after meeting Joseph, Partridge was convinced and was baptized shortly after their arrival. Joseph was immediately impressed by Rigdon's abilities and the fact that Rigdon seemed to be fully willing to help Joseph in any way that he could. Some of Joseph's close associates may have even been a little jealous that this sudden newcomer was so quickly becoming close to Joseph. Still, Joseph knew that now a large portion of the church already had a trust in Rigdon, and so Joseph brought him into his inner circle. Also, with the flurry of new baptisms and potentially more on the way in Kirtland, Joseph must have been considering if it might be better for the saints to gather farther west in Kirtland, Ohio, and get away from the harassment and trouble in New York. The intention was always to go west, so there is little doubt that Joseph was thinking and praying about this matter, and eventually he received the following instructions, which were read to the church at their January 2nd conference.
And again, a commandment I give unto the church, that it is expedient in me that they should assemble together at the Ohio. And there I will give unto you my law, and there you shall be endowed with power from on high, and from thence shall go forth among all nations, for I have a great work laid up in store.
So with this, the gathering of the saints into one place began. And while the final destination was still intended to be Missouri, Kirtland was to be the staging area for the time being. By the end of January 1831, with the church not even 1 year old, the saints began the cold move west, out of New York to Kirtland, Ohio, a journey of more than 250 miles, which overland would take about 2 weeks. Between January and June of 1831, the saints made their way either overland or by river and boats through the Great Lakes. Lucy Smith remembered the move in later years, including meeting a curious old woman who was not sure what to make of the group of travelers.
What be you? Be you Baptists?
We are Mormons.
Mormons? What be they? I never heard of them before.
I told you that we were Mormons because that is what the world calls us, but the only name we acknowledge is Latter-day Saints.
Latter-day Saints? I never heard of them either.
Eventually, Lucy's small band of people calling themselves Latter-day Saints arrived at the snow-covered docks in Buffalo, New York to take a ferry to Ohio. But Lucy got bad news when the captain informed them that the ice in the harbor was too thick, and they would likely be stuck there for 2 weeks. As you might imagine, the travelers were annoyed by this.
There I found several of the brethren and sisters engaged in a warm debate, others murmuring and grumbling. I stepped into their midst. Brethren and sisters, we call ourselves saints and profess to have come out from the world at the expense of all earthly things. And will you, at the very onset, subject the cause of Christ to ridicule by your own unwise and improper conduct? Here are my sisters pining for their rocking chairs, and brethren, from whom I expected firmness and energy, declare that they believe they shall starve to death before they get to the end of their journey. And why is it so? Have any of you lacked? Have I not set food before you every day and made you as welcome as my own children? Where is your faith? Where is your confidence in God? Now, brothers and sisters, if you will all raise your desires to heaven, that the ice may be broken up, as sure as the Lord lives, it will be done. At that instant, a noise was heard like bursting thunder. The captain cried, "Every man to his post!" The ice parted, leaving barely a passage for the boat.
Joseph and his wife Emma, now pregnant with twins, likely had arrived prior to Lucy in early February of 1831. They very soon met Elizabeth and Newell Whitney. Elizabeth and Newell were religious seekers who said they had a special spiritual experience about a year before Joseph's arrival, in which they were told that the word of the Lord would soon come to them. Elizabeth recounted what to her was a miraculous experience when Joseph first arrived at her husband's store in Kirtland.
Joseph Smith with his wife Emma drove up in front of my husband's store. Joseph jumped out and went in. He reached his hand across the counter to my husband and called him by name.
Newell Whitney, thou art the man.
My husband spoke, saying, I could not call you by name as you have me. He answered,
I am Joseph the prophet. You have prayed me here. Now what do you want of me?
Apparently, the Whitneys were so impacted by this experience that they offered Joseph and Emma to live in their apartment above their store, which Joseph and Emma accepted. The Whitneys and the Smiths quickly became friends as Emma neared her time to deliver. So now, with the backing of the respected Sidney Rigdon, Joseph seems to have been much more favorably received in Kirtland, and conversions and baptisms continued. The church likely more than doubled in size during that spring, and Joseph found himself increasingly amidst a growing number of friends. However, it also seems clear that some of the religious traditions and behavior of some of these new converts were a little bit odd to Joseph and needed correction. Lucy recalled what Joseph taught the people in Kirtland shortly after his arrival.
He said, if a man arose in meeting to speak and was seized with a kind of movement that drew his face and limbs in a violent and unnatural manner, and if he gave utterance to strange sounds which were incomprehensible to his audience, they might rely upon it that he had the spirit of the devil. But on the contrary, when a man speaks by the Spirit of God, he speaks from the abundance of his heart. His mind is filled with intelligence, and even should he be excited, it does not cause him to do anything ridiculous or unseemly.
However, despite the growing group of friends, tragedy struck again for Joseph and Emma on April 30th of 1831, just a couple of months after their arrival. Joseph and Emma were no doubt excited about their current pregnancy after the loss of their first child, whom Joseph had named after his hero and older brother Alvin. But now, on April 30th, Emma went into premature labor. She delivered the twins, a boy and a girl, which they named Thaddeus and Louisa, but neither survived the night. One can only imagine how heartbroken they were, but little did they know, another tragedy struck that same day in the home of John Murdoch across town. John's wife, who was also pregnant with twins, went into labor, but due to complications in the delivery, she died that same day and left John, a single father, with 5 children and 2 newborn twins. No doubt in the coming days, these families were connected in their grief. And it's very likely that Joseph and Emma could see the grief-stricken 39-year-old John Murdoch struggling to know how he was going to care not only for his 5 children, but now these twin infants. So an arrangement was made between them, and Joseph and Emma took in these newborn twins to raise them as their own. And so, in a very unexpected way, Joseph and Emma began their life as 25-year-old parents by adopting the Murdoch twins. And this began a new era in their story. Gone were the days of New York. The New Testament famously says a prophet is honored everywhere except in his hometown. And that was true of Joseph. But now he was in a new place, with new friends, and looking west towards the vision of establishing the central place, a righteous city of Zion where the saints could gather, prosper, and spread the fullness of Christ's gospel to the world. And this was to be Joseph's central focus and mission for the rest of his life.